I'm just so happy to be part of this entire extraordinary event. And I'm also very happy to introduce a woman that I've had the pleasure of speaking to throughout the day. And this is a presentation that I've been looking forward to, and I know you are all going to enjoy. So please, a very warm, generous welcome for Ms. Leah Libresco with FiveThirtyEight.com. She's a newswriter for that agency. So please, come on, more energy. Keep it going. Keep it going, Leah. Bring it, baby girl.
All right. Well, I'm here to talk to you about how to tell the truth with statistics, particularly truths about religion and about Catholicism. And I'm going to start by disappointing some of you. You know, this is a statistics talk, but I have unfortunately left all the very in-depth stuff about p-hacking and sample sizes and bias samples out of this presentation. So please find me at the networking coffee hour, whatever, and I can get a chalkboard. I'm sure there's one in a hotel somewhere, and we'll just go for it. Because I work at FiveThirtyEight, it's a site of very nerdy statisticians telling you about the news, and a lot of the time I find myself covering stories about religion. I wanted to share with you today some of the lessons I've learned in trying to use the statistics that are out there to talk about Catholics, trying to generate new data of my own when I need it to tell a story, and what you guys can do both to cover statistics well or to respond to people who are using it badly. So to start off with, may I have the next slide, please? One of the problems is that whenever you see a story about Catholics think, you should become suspicious right that second. Catholics think is a sentence that's very much like Americans think, or humans think, or residents of the solar system, but we didn't actually send surveyors to all of them, so bear with us, think, where you'll learn something from this kind of giant rolled up stat. But you won't learn very much. You've got a big mishmash of different kinds of people all bundled up together. And for most interesting things you want to do or say, you want to dive a little deeper. The Pew Research Center did a big report recently on U.S. Catholics and family life, and what they did is they looked at who are these people who call themselves Catholic, and tried to break them down into subtypes. And they said, well, there are people who are practicing Catholics, people who are cultural Catholics, for whom Catholicism still shapes a lot of how they view the world, but they aren't religiously connected with it anymore. People who are actively ex-Catholic, who have tried to break their ties and want to continue not having a connection to the church. People with some other Catholic connection, married to a Catholic, a lot of friends who are Catholic, feel Catholicism is nice. It's a whole range of things that land you in that category. And then, a little more than half the country, not Catholic. And one thing that's interesting just to begin with is whenever you ask about self-identified Catholics, you are often talking about almost half the country in America. And they're a big mishmash of a group. So a lot of the times whenever you see Catholics who use birth control, Catholics who disagree with the church, Catholics who say their favorite color is green and they'll wear it in whatever liturgical season they darn please, whatever it is that Catholics who answered a survey said, you often want to dig a little deeper. And to give you an example of kind of what you can find when you drill into something more than just Catholics, I'd like to show you the next slide. This is from an article I wrote for FiveThirtyEight that was about one of the articles you'll see all the time to start with of Catholics want the church to do different things. And what I was doing was drilling in a little more to say which Catholics want the church to do different things, what differentiates them from each other. And honestly, the thing I found when I got to explore the data set in a little more detail wasn't even something I expected. So what this is, and you don't have to zoom in on every single number, but I was looking at all Catholics, self-identified Catholics, who wanted a particular change. So I'm only showing Catholics who wish there would be communion for people who are cohabitating, or who wished priests would marry outside of Eastern Rite churches, or who favored, birth control being permitted to Catholics. So I just looked at those people and I wanted to see, all right, you want this to happen. Do you think it's going to? And the interesting thing is that it's the Catholics who attended Mass more often, those are the red dots, who rated all these changes as more likely to happen in their lifetime. And to be honest, this was for a daily news story, so it's not something I kept covering, but this is a kind of story that's great for Catholic media to supplement with interviews or profiles, where there is something interesting that the people who want change and expect it are the ones who stay engaged with the church. The people who want change and don't are the ones who say that they, go to church less than weekly to never. Are they staying because they assume they're going to a different church than the one they actually belong to? Are they staying because, they so believe that the church will wind up teaching the right thing, that they have a kind of faith in the church and that keeps them engaged and accessible for further conversation? I don't know. It's the kind of question I could only explore by looking at mass attendance, which is often the most helpful way to break down stats about Catholics. It tells you something about their practice. But as that Pew lineup showed, there are a lot of other ways to explore what people's ties to the church are, and then to shape the way you respond to these questions or desires differently. It's really interesting to know that a lot of the people who want to change and expect it to happen are in the pews listening to the homily every week. And you get to decide what to do next with that data in a way you can't when you just have the usual, a lot of Catholics disagree with the church. But sometimes it's not enough just to try and break down the data with more granularity. Because a lot of the time, as journalists, as people, just sharing stories with each other, you're working with someone else's data. And you're going to find that there are ways that people have run their survey that you would not have run it. May I have the next slide? So I like Pew a lot, which is why I feel okay with picking on this question they did. Pew had a question where they were asking Catholics, do you think these things are sins? Do you think homosexual behavior is a sin? Do you think it's a sin to live outside of marriage? Do you think it's a sin to remarry without an annulment? Do you think it's a sin to get a divorce? And total credit to Pew. They've broken this down themselves by weekly mass attendance, less often than weekly mass attendance, so you can differentiate the people who are kind of already engaged in the church and the people who are more distant. That's great. Here's what I didn't have that I really, really wanted when I was working on this story. How many Catholics in either group ever feel comfortable using the word sin to describe anything? I don't know. I don't know because I didn't write this survey, but I'm looking at this and I can't tell whether the reason that so many people are uncomfortable, saying a divorce would be a sin or living together outside of marriage would be a sin is because they're specifically uncomfortable with characterizing that behavior as sinful, or because if I put almost anything in front of them, things that aren't cultural hot-button issues, is lying a sin, is stealing a sin, if they would say every time, there's a subset of people who would probably say every time, oh, no, I mean, you shouldn't, but I don't want to say someone's a bad person, right? There's some subset of each of these numbers that are the group of Catholics who refuse to call anything a sin, especially over the phone to a pollster. And without having some kind of baseline that's not a question that's controversial to kind of anchor my understanding, how many of these people would say stealing is a sin? That's really, I think, the question I would have wanted to add to this survey. It's hard for me to report on these numbers because I don't quite know what story I'm telling. And a lot of the time, thinking about the question you frame, running through your head, like, what could cause someone to answer no? Is it just disagreement, or is it something different I can tease out? Is there a way I can talk to the researcher? It's really worth doing because there are a lot of stories that are about Catholics that are more about the questions we ask Catholics than necessarily what they all think. But it's tough because, a lot of the time I'm not the one running a survey myself. I'm a journalist. I'm looking for press releases. I'm looking for groups that do research. I'm looking for academics. And I have to work with what I find. And here's an example of the kind of thing I wind up having to work with. May I have the next slide? So I'm a political reporter. So occasionally I have to write stories about whatever thing someone has recently said on TV. And I wound up writing a story about Donald Trump's comments that women should be punished for having an abortion. And the first thing I did, because I'm a statistician, was looking through data on what people feel about the word punishment with regards to abortion. And this was really the only survey I could find. Now, first of all, it's a 15-year-old survey. So, I'm not happy about that. My editor's not happy about that. This is did you know that at some point, once in the past, this is a thing people thought one time? It's not a very rich story to begin with. And once again, the question is lousy. The question is, who should be punished when there's an abortion if it were illegal, is basically the question the LA Times asked. And I had the distribution, so I've got all the numbers lined up here, right? I transcribed them accurately. 32% think it should be the doctor, 20% say everyone, 10% the woman, 1% the father. 23% no and 12% not sure. Don't even bother memorizing those numbers, because here's the problem with this survey. What did people mean when they said punished? I don't know. The surveyor doesn't know. The people may not be quite sure what they meant at the time, 15 years ago. If I were to say, do you remember on last Tuesday, 15 years ago, what kind of punishment were you thinking of exactly? But again, the trouble is, especially for me as a Catholic reporter who's trying to thread the needle of reporting things accurately, not causing scandal, telling the truth boldly, I don't know what to do with these numbers. If I just run them as is, the trouble is every reader I have is going to bring their own guess as to what everyone meant by punished in the moment. So someone who's kind of very skeptical of the pro-life view might go, I bet they wanted them killed. And honestly may have met some people who said the appropriate thing is the death penalty. You murdered someone, the appropriate thing is the death penalty, right? So they're not making it up necessarily, but they might go, I assume everyone involved in that survey, that's what I think. Someone else goes oh, I bet they just meant, punished in the sense of a hug, but with a frowny face, right? And every reader is going to bring something different when I put up these technically objective 15-year-old numbers. Now, in this case, I was kind of lucky while I was covering Trump's remarks, because it turned out, that I had a different data set to go on that was a little more recent, a little less rigorous, and a lot harder to come by. Next slide, please. Back one. I went to. So that's me. I'm very cold. I went to the March for Life this year to survey March for Life protesters. And one of the reasons I did that is it just seemed like a fertile source of data that usually wasn't covered. One of the main things I tend to see after the March for Life are articles about how many people were there, articles about that previous set of articles and whether they were accurate about how many people were there, and interviews that are kind of more drawn out interviews with anecdotes, profiles of the people protesting. And all of those things are useful, but as a statistician, some people look at the March for Life and see a field of activists fighting to save the most vulnerable among us, and I see that too, but I also go, a giant walking data set. Send me there. And my editor did. So as a journalist, I walked through and counted off every 5 protesters to try and get a sampling, and then asked each person if they would do a quick 10-question survey with me, which gave me about 60 to 70 responses, which is not enough for a scientific journal. It is not enough for me to say something, I know something about America, the entire pro-life movement, or even I know something very specific about the marchers themselves, but it adds a little bit of perspective to a question like the one I just showed you that was kind of not written in the way I needed it to be. So when I did go out and get this data, now next slide, instead of me being super cold in a blizzard, I found out some things that just I hadn't seen asked of March for Life protesters in a comprehensive way as opposed to in individual interviews and profiles. I found that of the people I surveyed, 72% of them knew someone personally who had an abortion, that they weren't kind of reasoning about this in the abstract and weren't disengaged from the women who were considering abortion. I found that 18% didn't always describe themselves as pro-life. So again, in terms of what can I do to bring these stories, to complicate other stories that are going on, it's not just a bunch of radicals who were brought up by their parents and have never heard another argument. It's people who either found themselves to be neutral or who were actively on the other side, or a decent chunk of people there. And then I did get to ask the question that turns out I needed a couple months later about what kind of punishment people thought was appropriate if abortion were illegal, which is always a thing I see speculated on and never asked, or at least never asked specifically of pro-lifers. I'll see general surveys sometimes, like that LA Times one I saw, but always comments about what pro-lifers must want and very few questions for them directly. And I got a whole big range of things, honestly. I didn't find that there was a single pro-life agenda about what the penalty for abortion should be if it were illegal. I got a bunch of people who said they weren't sure when it was about the woman, and a lot of volunteered answers that I didn't put in this table. Everything from counseling to even financial support for someone who might have been considering it or drawn to it by poverty. I got mostly the counseling responses about the women, but I got one person who just said, oh, and counseling for the doctor too. The doctor needs healing also. I hadn't actually thought of putting counseling in my list of options I provided. So once again, there's always a vulnerability to what the survey maker thinks of, and I had missed that one. It came up often enough I should have included it. But by going out and getting my own data, I was able to kind of bring that back, both immediately after the March for Life and after Trump's remarks, to tell a more complicated story about the pro-life movement and about mostly Catholics, I did survey them on their religion, than was available, because the data that existed didn't help me tell a story fully and truthfully. So as final takeaways, next slide. If you want to go out there and be as wise as serpents and as numerate as statisticians, never, ever, ever let someone say to you, did you know Catholics think? Like, unquestioned. Drill in deeper to the numbers if you can. If it's not available, raise the point that it's hard to speak generally about Catholics, just like it's hard to speak generally about Americans. It can be useful to take a snapshot, but it's not very good as a guide to action or communication. Ask yourself what a question's really measuring and what could have led people to pick different answers that aren't really the question you're interested in asking about. When you can, work with a researcher ahead of time. Go out and gather your own data and try and get the questions that you need. And of course, you can always, when you run out of access to data, try and just complicate a pat narrative by going out to get, quantitative data of your own, like I did, or doing more interviews just to add color and perspective. Because remember, for many journalists who work with these numbers, we're drawing from just a very narrow pool of numbers that are available to us. People aren't trying to tell bad stories. They're trying to tell any story. And I've killed a lot of stories at my job because there just was no polling data available on the questions that I wanted to cover. If you want good sources, Pew is great on religion. CARA, the Center for Applied Research, and the Apostolate is great. But you can often go out and do small projects on your own, even just to say, wow, like I got a broader range of answers to this question when I tried to ask a different question. So I ask you guys to go out, pick like very polite fights, and to kind of help complete the work of statisticians by telling a more complicated story than a single number can do, which can start a conversation and start guiding a question, but really isn't enough to finish the conversation. Put the humans at the heart of the story and try and include as much of the complexity as you can reasonably cram into survey research. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness, Leah, if you were one of my teachers, I actually would have passed statistics. That was wonderful. I think, I don't know if you'll agree with me, but I feel just listening to you talk, Leah is the personification of somebody who loves what they do, and they're able to just incorporate the faith and show how it has meaning in every single aspect of our lives. And really, that's what we're doing here today. So one more round of applause. Leah, thank you so very much.